Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. As people approach midlife, they find themselves kind of itchy to try to change the way things are for themselves. After all, with a lot of reflection and experience and perhaps grown wisdom, we realize that doing things the way we were brought up to do them just didn't lead to the life and the results that we were hoping for. On our program today, we decided to delve into this particular story to find out what about it is it that we can change. And if we change our story, is it possible that our life changes as well? Well, our guest today believes that is. He'll be blending a array of Jungian analytics and shamanic practices to tap into the unconscious mind and access the innate power that dwells within all of us. Our guest today received his Ph.D. in practicing clinical psychologist, Jungian analyst, and shamanic practitioner. He received his Ph.D. from Columbia University and was on their faculty teaching finance and management. He joins us on the Beyond 50 radio program today to talk about how we can change our story to change our lives. Carl Greer, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you, Daniel. Nice to be here.
Now, what moved you into this direction to help people to change their stories?
As a psychologist and Jungian analyst, have heard many stories. And I saw that some people felt stuck and trapped in the stories that they were living. And so I thought it would be useful to talk about that phenomenon and then give some suggestions as to how people could get free of stories within which they were trapped.
Now, how does that start for a person where they get trapped in their own story?
It requires a person to be willing to step back from their lives, even for a short period of time, and reflect on what their story is. And they need to really be very honest to see what is. And I have practices in my book where I suggest how they might do that. And then once they've done that, they need to decide what they would like it to be. And then they're at that juncture where if they like it to be different, they have to ask themselves, why hasn't it been different? And then I get into practices that help them realize some of the inner unconscious resistances that have kept them from changing.
Now, how did you approach it from the direction that you had? Tell people how different it is, if in fact it is, where it's been effective.
I've worked with a lot of people over the years, and I've also had workshops where people have done these practices, where they have used shamanic and Jungian practices to get into their unconscious. And I've been able to see enough cases where people have changed that I believe in the power of that which I have been writing about and teaching.
Yeah, it's just such fascinating work, when you take a look at a lot of times that people go into, let's say, talk therapy, and they just realize they're just kind of sharing the same story over and over again and really never coming to any conclusions or changes. Do you actually encourage them to do that, to share their stories, or do you just kind of really dive right in to see how the changes can be made?
I think you need a baseline, Daniel. I think you need to really know what the story is. Okay. And so I think it's very important that people have their stories heard in a very respectful way. And sometimes saying it out loud is a start for them, or writing it down is a start. But then you do have to come to that place of what is your true story, not the story you'd like others to believe about you, but telling your own truth in terms of your story about your health, your relationships, your psychology, your jobs, and so forth. Once you have that truth, and if you want it to be a different story, then you have to really ask yourself, why haven't you been able to make it different up until this point in your life?
Now, it's fascinating because a lot of times people find themselves caught in a story, and then there's the outside evidence about it being true. And like this day and age with the economic downturn, which seems to be something that's out of our control, people not being able to keep up or stay with their jobs and the like, and then they kind of realize over and over, why does this happen to me? Why is it better for that person over there than for myself? How do you move somebody through that to help them believe that that's not true? That's just the way things may be, but you can decide to choose how it affects you.
Yeah, I think what you said is the truth, and that is sometimes we can't control factors outside of us, but we certainly can, as you said, choose to how they do live within us and what we're going to do as a result. And I think some people are just more resilient than others. Some people get defeated and never come back from that external event. And I'm suggesting ways that people can tap into inner wisdom and energy to better contend with these exogenous outside forces. And even if they don't make discernible outside changes, they're not as perturbed and affected by it because their attitude towards them changes. But I would say that in many cases, they are able to then go in another direction that when they look back, it's really better than where they were before.
Now, one of the things that I liked about what I was reading in your book is how you help people to create their own ritual. Tell us about that.
I think if we can see our lives as part of a bigger picture than we often do, and that we were someplace before we got here. We're here for some reason, and we ask ourselves the question, why are we here, who are we, what are we, and where are we going to be after we're no longer in these physical bodies. We get a sense that we're part of this larger picture. Ritual helps us connect to it in a very respectful way, expressing gratitude, and just those connections, Daniel, I feel, give us the possibility of information and, again, energy to make changes. So we have rituals to honor this bigger picture that we're part of, and in a reciprocal way, then we get new insights as to how we might change our story.
Now, because you work with Jungian psychology, I remember that Carl Jung was really big about dream work, and
yes.
that you talk about that as well in the book. Describe for our listeners how powerful that can be to utilize the ability to not only remember, but to work with dreams, especially with what we're talking about today, which is changing our story.
Well, if a person does buy into the idea that one of the reasons that they have been unable to change their story, even though consciously they want to, if they believe that there must therefore be some unconscious resistances to change, one way to get a picture of those unconscious resistances is through dream work. And so if a person will write down their dreams, will try to read them 2 or 3 times and really see what they are. I talk about associating to dream images, what comes to your mind with a particularly powerful image in a dream. And then I talk in my book about interacting with these images through a process I call dialoguing, get more information about them, get a sense of the emotional tenor of a dream, see where in your waking life those same themes and emotions may be playing out. It's all information that part of us, our rational, reflective part, can use to get insights as to those unconscious processes that may be affecting us that without the dream work we wouldn't be aware of.
Now, I kind of like there was one exercise that was really interesting, and, the fact is, when we're young, we feel that we've got all the time in the world. We just don't think about, doing the things that we want to do immediately because, we can always put it off until tomorrow. We start aging, we start realizing that our mortality is seemingly right around the corner. And one of the things that you were talking about was an exercise where it's a journey to meet death, and I found that was interesting. Tell us about that.
In the shamanic world, death is seen as an ally. The death is at our shoulder from the moment we're born. So the question is, how do we relate to that energy? And I believe that it's possible to engage ideas, symptoms, energies, and have a relationship with them. And I talk in the book about a journey to death, to ask in this particular moment of the journey, what message, death, do you have for me? What message do you want me to take back as to what you want from me? Then you can ask during the journey any questions you have of death. And then you might ask, death, what can I do for you? The notion, Daniel, is that in all these interactions in these transpersonal realms, you want to not just be taking, you want to be having right relationship with these energies, and so you're going to ask for things, but you want to ask, what can I give to you as a response to the work that we've just done? And I found that when people engage death in this way, they really have a whole different attitude towards it afterwards. And and I give examples in the book about some of the experiences people have had with death that can be transforming.
Well, and I believe that. And when you talk about blending, for instance, earlier we were talking about Jungian psychology, and I mentioned that he liked to work with dreams. I remember there was a time when I was having a series of dreams where I felt like I was about to die, and I'd run off into a room somewhere but then hope somebody would come in and somehow do whatever they need to do to help save me. And then finally there was a point where I just decided, you know what, I'm just going to let myself die just to see what happens. And that's exactly what I did in the dream. And that's why I thought that was such a powerful aspect that you were talking about in here. And what had happened was that I did. I actually died, and all of a sudden there was just this incredible serenity and this beauty. I mean, it was just like everything was okay. This is more than I... In other words, I'm saying that to die was a fantastically beautiful experience, and after that I realized I just didn't worry about things that I thought were so big before. And I think that a lot of times, and I'm sure with you working with people that you have over the years, that as they realize if they could experience that, then they might realize maybe it was being alive that was so scary.
Being alive in the way they had been alive.
Right.
And no, I think that's beautiful. A couple of things come to mind when you're talking about that. One is what you said about you realize that some of the other things weren't that such a big deal anymore. It's that idea of having your life kind of relativized by these transpersonal experiences. And the other thing you said about you surrendered to the energy. And let these big energies just do what they needed to do instead of fighting it. And that you got a sense of relief, but you also got some wisdom from it. And that's one of the things I'm trying to make the point of in the book. Not only that it's important, but how one might do that.
Now, how often, I'm kind of curious, Carl, because I think this was important, especially for our listeners out there, is that we do have what is known as our shadow self. It's the self that we tend to not really want to expose or perhaps even run from. Some interesting examples of that, of course, were the broadcaster Rush Limbaugh. He couldn't stand drug addicts, but then, he ended up getting himself in a sling with cocaine, for instance.
Right.
That the people that tend to advocate harshly against people they consider to be lesser people, for instance, there was that politician in New York, couldn't stand prostitutes, but there he was caught with one, and you see these kinds of things over and over. Yes. How often is our story, I guess, in relation to the shadow self, a result of us trying to protect from people seeing or having that part of ourselves exposed?
I think a lot. It's the shadow is just I use Jungian terminology to explain some of these energies that we encounter when we do the journey work and the dream work, because I think it's useful and it's kind of in our culture. But it's a perfect example that you just gave of why it's hard to change our stories unless we are more aware of what actually is going on inside of us unconsciously. And a good indication of when you have an energy inside of you you don't want to own up to is when you have a very, very strong reaction to somebody else. That, I don't like this person, or in some cases, shadow can be positive qualities. I really have a strong admiration for them because I think that I really don't have those qualities myself. So in both cases, usually though it's the more negative. I think ill of somebody, but I'm not really willing to own that same aspect of myself. I think somebody's very, very stingy. I may not recognize my own stinginess. Or I think somebody else is very big-hearted, but I may not really own my own capacity to be big-hearted. Mm-hmm. So it's just all information that we can use, and you need an ego, a frontal lobe ability to kind of reflect and examine what is in some kind of an objective way, so that ultimately it's not just being able to name your shadow, it's being able to, in those moments, now when you have been judgmental about somebody else, to maybe have a different reaction and a different stance towards life. And that's how changes start to take place at the margin. Once you have more wisdom and information about those unconscious parts of yourself that heretofore have been keeping you from changing.
Now, give me an idea, if you could, of the people that come to you and they decide, I'm kind of curious about pursuing this. What are they usually there for? What happens in their lives that cause them to finally step in this direction?
That's a question that can be answered different ways. One way to frame it would be, why do people come to see therapists? And or analysts or healers. Surprisingly, Daniel, the biggest reason that usually is relationship issues, and then maybe depression or some psychological anxiety. But then once you start to talk about the symptom, they're embedded in a larger picture of a person's life. Mm-hmm. And then you start to see wherever they start, all these things are interconnected. Their health, their relationships, their psychologies, their jobs, their being of service in the world, their relationship to a higher power, their attitudes towards money, sex, time, authority. All these things are interrelated, and it doesn't make a whole lot of difference where you start, but you eventually get to them needing to be very honest about what has been their truth up until the time that you're meeting with them.
And I think, too, Carl, what's fascinating is you realize that most of the story that we've been living and believing, that we feel this sense of anxiety because we realize that's not really our story at all. We get it from our parents. We get it through the school, when we go to, especially the school. I think over the last 8 years I've been beating up on the free school system we have here in America because, and I know there are good-intentioned teachers and so forth and so on, but you hear consistently a running theme that something about what happened in school changed people, in such a way to make them realize that when they went out in the world, they believed a lot of what they learned. But hey, look, we were children. Your power was within the hands of your mother and your father, and they surrendered it over to the headmasters of the place that you go get educated, and boom, and you just know something inherently is off, and the frustration people start feeling as they're approaching midlife, thinking, the way I was taught, the way that was important, and it goes on and on, just doesn't make any sense to me anymore. Is it safe for me to move in a new and more authentic direction? That's what I love about shamanism, is it puts you right there, I suppose, at the cliff and says, are you willing to take the next step? Because that's where you have to put yourself to, realize who you truly are, and the second thing is to realize where the miracles are, right at your fingertips.
Yeah, and the prelude to that is just what you said. We're programmed through our culture, through our schools, through our parents, through our lives, through our fears, to live in pretty habitual patterns. And it takes a lot of courage to break through of those. The things about the practices in this book, they're very experiential. It's not somebody else telling you, you ought to do this, these are 5 ways to, make changes. It's you interacting in these other realms, having experiences, and then your point about the courage to either live out of them or not. But it's you with you, not to say you can't have help and other people to give you guidance and counsel. But ultimately, change requires a person to make the change themselves.
Now, here's an interesting thing that I want our listeners to know, because there's some really great exercises in here, but this one really reminded me, for instance, of, I think it was the book, The Art of Dreaming, and that was Carlos Castaneda talking about how Don Juan was talking or sharing with him how you work with dreams. But anyway, here's what it is. Let me see, let's get an idea here. Whatever it is you do in the world, your career, volunteer work, or homemaking activities, ask these questions of the symbol or symbol bearer, okay? Now, what I liked about this is just exactly what it is here. What message do you have for me? What do you want from me? What can I do for you? And will you give me? And then fill in the blank. Now, tell us why that's effective. That was really interesting, because in light of the book that I was just mentioning about The Art of Dreaming, that was the idea of the nightmare that Don Juan says. When you have the nightmare, there's usually a symbol, whether it's an animal or whether it's a person, whatever it is that causes you to have that fear. And that what you do is you ask, what is it that you want from me, sort of a thing. You actually get into a dialogue. But then what he suggests is then what you do is you end up killing it, and then you take something from it, so to speak, And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting way of approaching nightmares. But the fact is our dreams constantly are bringing us messages for those who remember what happens in their dreams. But to get to a level where you start having that running dialogue, it's quite interesting how the answers have always been inside of us.
Yes. No, I agree with what you said. And you get those images and symbols not just from dreams, but from shamanic journeys, which I describe a variety of them, from being in nature and having these synchronistic events. A person may have a crucial time in their life, where the time of transition, and they're out in nature, and all of a sudden they see an eagle that comes 10 feet from them that's never been there before. And sometimes they'll say, well, gee, what does that mean? And they'll go look in a book, what do eagles mean? And I always suggest, ask the eagle, ask the image, that energy of the eagle, why are you here? What message? And it's amazing, Daniel, the information that people get from that conversation, that inner dialogue.
Mm-hmm. How about you? Was there a time where something like that happened? And give us share the story with us.
I was one time on a journey, and I was in the presence of this very, very oppressive energy. And in the past, I'd have ways to try to, have guides and, to help me work with that. But I had the realization as I was interacting with this that there are some things that you just can't have others fix for you, and it was going to be up to me, not spirit, not the idea you turn it all over to somebody else or to spirit. I believe that, but it's a yes, but sometimes you have to do what you have to do, and whatever I did in that moment because of that was very liberating for me. And then the further inner conversation to me was how it led me to see at times when I thought I was pretty self-sufficient and independent, how I was really dependent on others or situations to fix things or do things for me. So the experience allowed me to have a lot of inner conversations that became very, very transformative for me going forward after that.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating work here. The book is Change Your Story, Change Your Life. It's using shamanic and Jungian tools to achieve personal transformation. When someone has worked with you, what kind of changes have you seen, or what do they express to you, the joy that they have actually come and realized, wow, I could never have believed that this could happen for me?
I've seen a process for people, and then I've seen the result. And the process is usually one where they'll have these transcendent experiences and they just feel liberated, completely different. But then, a week, 2 or 3 later, then they're kind of slipping back into their old ways. So the first thing I'd say about that is the change is incremental. But as they continue to do these processes, people will say, as they stick on the path, they become calmer in the face of life exigencies. They have more of an inner peace. They feel they're at the margin, less reactive. They have the ability to be more reflective in the moment and make different choices. But it's all very incremental, and all of a sudden, 6 months, 8 months later, they say, yeah, I'm different. And one of the things that they have gotten, those who have done that, and there have been a number, they're better able to resist the pressures of those around them who really don't want them to change. Because one of the problems for people want to change is you're in a system of relationships where people like you the way they are for whatever reason. And so to make changes is scary. And one of the things I have seen that people do this work, they're better able to be their own person in the face of others who don't want them to be.
That is the hardest thing, too, when you decide you want to change your life. You realize that you've built relationships that identify with who you were. And then when you begin to make those changes, there's a chance that you might lose some of those relationships, and you have to ask yourself, how important is this change? And sometimes it could be pretty awesome when you consider that's considerably an obstacle or potential obstacle that you may face.
Absolutely, and it's scary. But oftentimes when people do it and then they change that or lose that relationship, they say, why was I so afraid of that? It never did serve me. It wasn't that good for me. I feel so much better off no longer being entangled.
Carl, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the program. I really like the blend that you have in here, and I'm interested to read more and actually put some of this, in practice, because I found it very exciting that, here was someone that you realize that from the inside out is where you make the change, and as you said, it becomes incremental. There may be times you feel that you're doing the work, and, life is still throwing the same things at you, but when you think of physics and inertia, energy does what it was doing before until you get it to do something else. But once it starts to take hold, as physics shows, it becomes profound, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a new world, and it takes incremental changes for you to be able to handle those kinds of changes in the first place. It never just changes overnight like the movies would lead us to believe.
So true. And the critical mass is really smaller than you think. You think you may be been around for 200,000 or 300,000 hours in your life, and you want to spend 20 hours in therapy or 50 hours doing this work. But it's amazing how that 50 or 100 hours can really, at the margin, make a big difference if you do it with intention and you're connected to these larger energies.
Absolutely. Carl, I want to thank you again for joining us here on the program today. Could you give our listeners a website they can find out more about how to get the book and, maybe some tools or practices they can start implementing there as well?
Yes. Well, I'm on Facebook. My website is www.carlgreer.com. My publisher is Findhorn Press. The book is available online from Amazon. It's at Barnes & Noble online. And again, it's Change Your Story, Change Your Life by Carl Greer.
Very good, Carl. Again, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Daniel.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. Again, change your story, you'll change your life. And it's pretty guaranteed, because when you think about the story that you're telling yourself, there's languages, there's words that you use, there's things you believe in. When you make those incremental changes, you'll realize you'll be a completely different person. And the question then is, what will you do then? Change Your Story, Change Your Life is the name of the book, and our guest today, Carl Greer. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. We'll have a hot link for you there where you can find out more as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.